I wanted to make some videos about academic papers and other academic stuff from psychology and social science, because I think that maybe I can put some new spin on it if I talk about it. So because these kind of academic papers are not as popular as they could be. For example, they're not as popular as YouTube videos or books. So maybe we need to talk more about them so this kind of knowledge can be spread around to everyone. And I try to uh, make a review of this paper or like talk a bit about it, but I won't talk about everything because it's pretty long. So I will just like mention some of the few points in this very interesting paper actually. It's called Dodging Darwin, Race, Evolution, and the Hereditarian Hypothesis by Ben Weingart, and Jonathan Anomaly. And it's a very interesting and maybe controversial paper for some people. So let's look into it. What this paper is about is that there are different groups among humans, and these different groups can have different cognitive abilities and different intellectual abilities. So basically, IQ differs between human ethnic groups. And their conclusion is that yes, it is something that's a real thing, and we know that for sure. We do know that IQ differs between human groups, but their conclusion is also that it's actually hereditarian. So it's caused by genes and not just by culture variables or some, different local cultures. And that's a very interesting conclusion. And they do know that it's controversial, and they do point that out in the paper. And actually, this is something that's very controversial in psychology. So this makes this paper extra interesting because it's not a paper that has a lot of similar papers to it published in the same year, right? So if you publish a paper on this stuff, it will kind of take over the market. It will be a unique paper in this category, at least for some time, and because it's a very controversial topic, and a lot of universities may not feel comfortable about their professors working with the subject and doing research on the subject. Yeah, and as they say, especially the black and white IQ gap is something that's a very emotional topic in the public debate, and something that can make people very angry. But they will go into that, and they will explain why they think that this IQ gap is not environmental and why it's hereditarian. So page 2. First thing first, they do mention a lot of things that differ between human populations. For example, that there are areas like the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau and the Simian Plateau in Ethiopia where people live high up in altitude. So usually if for example Europeans go up into the mountains, we will get the mountain sickness and we will feel unwell, and we for sure would not want to live in these kind of areas up high. But there are groups of people who live up high in plateaus, and they do seem to thrive and survive and do the daily activities as regular people because their genes have adapted to the local environment, right? Like natural selection, but this is in human groups. So we do know that these things are going on, and we do know that this kind of evolution has taken place after we wandered out of Africa. And I think most of people would agree on these kind of evolutionary changes. So this is not cognitive changes, but bodily changes. And they go into that too later. They do explain that most people agree that we do see that there are differences in bodies between people, but sometimes we ignore the brain. And lactose tolerance, again, the same thing. For example, in China, only like 10% of people can tolerate milk and drink it regularly. So that's of course a huge difference, because in Europe, for example, cows and milk production and eating cheese, drinking milk has been a huge part of the culture and has been a huge part of how Europe developed, and especially in Northern Europe, where I'm from, that has been a huge thing, and something that has shaped society in a huge way. So having 90% of Chinese not being able to drink milk is actually for me a very significant thing. That's again a race or group or ethnic group difference. Then they go into counter arguments, and they try to dispel these counter arguments one by one. And I will talk a bit about that, but not too much. So the first counter argument we see here is there are no races, only clans, right? So we cannot categorize people into races because we have a lot of variables between groups, but there are no clear cutoff. So we cannot say that, well, this race is here and this race is here, or this race starts with these genes and this race ends with these genes. That's the argument, right? That there are no races because there are no clear category. Well, the first counter argument they bring forth is maybe not as powerful as it could have been, but it's very interesting. It's about age. So we have adolescents, we have middle-aged, and we have elderly, right? We have these categories, but there's no cutoff. Like there's no cutoff for middle age. When are you middle age? Is it when you turn 45 or 46 or maybe 45 and a half, right? There's no cutoff. So in principle, these are also clients in a way, but they are real categories. We do know that some people can be middle-aged. We do know that some people can be elderly or adolescent. And these categories just don't disappear just because someone mentions that, well, age is a variable that doesn't have any cutoff. And a second counter argument is also pretty interesting. It's about Norway. So someone from southern Norway and northern Norway will be more similar to each other than someone from Norway, any part of Norway, to someone in Central Africa. Again, it's not because there's a clear cutoff between southern Norway and northern Norway, or maybe even Norway and Finland or whatever, but we do see that there are quite a few differences between Norwegians and people in Central Africa, and we do see that these are different groups, like age categories. Someone can be a teenager, someone can be middle-aged. And with races is of course a greater split than in the age categories. Another counter argument is pretty interesting. It's that you can group people into any kind of group. So you can actually just say, well, these two groups they have anti-malarial genes, and other groups don't have. So you need to group these two groups together, even though one of these anti-malarial genes groups can be in Africa and the other group can be in South America or whatever, right? They say, right, well, you can group people based on any kind of race category. And the counter argument is, of course, that this doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's not how we group things in real life, right? We do look at evolutionary history and shared ancestry, genetic profiles, and overall phenotypic profiles. So we do actually try to make sense of this, right? We're not just grouping stuff randomly. We're not going, well, wolves have 4 legs and lions have 4 legs, so we group wolves and lions together in one species or whatever, right? Or maybe wolves are gray and some whales are gray, so now we have one species, the gray species. There's also, it doesn't really make sense, right? You need to look at it rationally and create categories that make sense according to what you research, according to your finding and studies. So we do actually know quite a bit about this. We do know quite a bit about species too. And in principle, you can also always say that, well, all categories are arbitrary, but we do try to make sense of it and study it in a practical manner. Yeah. One interesting counter argument is actually brought forth by Richard Leviton. He has a lot of curious arguments that are kind of silly, and they are used a lot by people who may be referred to as blank slaters, or people who don't really believe that groups or single individuals maybe even have genetic variability. They use Richard Leviton's arguments a lot because they are simple and they're direct, and you can just refer to them and then not say anything else, right? It's a lazy kind of argument style, but the curious thing about his arguments is that they are not that interesting or deep, and they are pretty easy to dispute. So actually his arguments have become the go-to counter argument for hereditarians. They use his arguments a lot because they are so easy to dispute that it makes all the other side look silly. So just something to keep in mind before, because I see a lot of people try to use Richard Leviton's counter arguments because they feel like they're simple and they kind of make sense if you don't think about it, but if you do think about it, they sound really, really silly. So be careful with that. Like, try to look into the argument and try to see if the argument actually makes any sense. Try to dispel it. Try to work a lot with it. Like, think about it a lot. See what other people have said about it before you use it. Because it can be like one of these kind of simple statements that sounds interesting and it's easy to replicate, it's easy to remember, right? Everyone can remember these counterclaims, but there are no truth to them, at least not much truth to them. For example, with that variation within human populations is much greater than between human populations. So in one population you will have very tall people and very short people, and in another population you will have also very tall and short people, but the difference between these two groups may be very small, like only 10 centimeters, right? So for him that makes sense to say that, well, because the differences in the group are greater than the between the groups, then we shouldn't study the between groups differences because they are so small and insignificant. And well, the counter argument is of course pretty obvious, right? They go into that here. It doesn't really make sense to say that because there could be very, very significant differences between the groups, and they could mean a lot. Like, they could really mean a lot in how the groups behave, how they act, and how well they're doing in the modern industry society. And for them, they also explain that, for example, a few genes can actually be a whole lot of difference. So a small allele difference in allele A can mean a huge difference overall in the group, because if one group has a lot of allele Bs and the other groups has a lot of allele As, and these alleles actually do influence the phenotypical traits in a huge way, then of course we will see a lot of differences between these groups, even if their genetic disposition is very similar to each other. So you cannot just count genes and then say, well, most of these genes are the same because I counted them, so these groups must be similar. That's not how it works. And again, they go into this again, that there's a lot of, there can be a lot of small differences too. So you cannot just count differences and say, well, it's not that many differences. Because, for example, between male and female faces, maybe if you count differences or look at single differences and look at eyes, for example, we can look at eyes and say, well, men and women have similar type of eyes, so men and women are similar in their face structures. Because I looked at every single trait one at a time: mouth, eyes, eyebrows, lips, and all of these traits only had very, very small differences, so therefore there's no difference between a male and female face. Well, this doesn't make any sense because there is a huge difference between a male and female face. But we see that difference because we see all these traits combined, right? We see this whole face and this whole face, and then we compare these two. So it doesn't just make sense to look at nails between nail difference in one group and then nails in another group, and then say, well, there's only a very small difference here, so it's no difference, and then look at all other traits the same way, like, oh, well, maybe we could look at height, or maybe we could look at weight, or maybe we could look at how well they run, and then not really find anything because all these differences can be small. And they classify races into Africans, Asians, Europeans, Americans, and Oceanians. Yes. So that's quite curious, because as they say here, that you can go into the granular scales and go into deeper analysis. So you can categorize people into these 5 races, and that's usually what we do, or groups, like they want to call them, because they don't want to use the word race for obvious reasons. But you can also go down into a deeper granular scale and categorize people into even more groups. So you can say, well, this is a human population, it's one species. You can also say this is a human population and we have 5 ethnic groups. You can also go into deeper categories and then, for example, look at Asians and then categorize Asians into different subgroups that have different genetic dispositions. And you can go down until you hit the human being, right? So every human being is a single individual. So there's actually a scale there. You can move back and forth. And this is why you cannot really say that there's an exact number of races. We do think it's 5. Like, that's the common category we use in studies, in text, and in papers. But if you need a more fine scale to look at smaller differences between, for example, let's say you want to look at differences between Danes and Italians, right? So they have different genetic disposition, different skin color, different heights, different intelligences. They have small differences also in personality, and all of this has a genetic disposition. And you want to study these 2 differences, then you have to, of course, split these populations up into finer scales. But overall, it's all one group of Europeans. Yeah, and here they talk about people who ignore brain differences, because they do actually say that there are phenotypical differences between people, but just not brain differences. So they are all physical, but not psychological differences. And this is kind of weird, because they look at the evolutionary pressure and they do see that people have evolved over time, and they do see that have been changed even after we went out of Africa, that they have been changed in single groups. But they refuse to believe that these changes have influenced the brain in any way. And they call these people liberal creationists or selective dualists. So here, yeah, or what we often call them is blank slaters, because they believe in evolution, but they don't believe in the evolution of the human brain in a sort of way. So they can be blank slaters in some way. Now, also a special category of these people that are not blank slaters. I will go into that a bit later. And here they talk about lying and how noble lies have been told a lot through history, and we do want to lie to the public a lot. It's not a good thing, but it does happen, and these noble lies are about whatever we want to tell the common population. So if we want to tell the population that there are no gender differences, we can do that. And if we want to tell the population that no ethnic group differences, we can do that. But they don't agree that this is a good thing. They say that this is a bad thing overall. Because telling a lie it's a negative thing, and you really need to explain why you're telling the lie, and really need to have a good reasoning for it. And to have that good reasoning, it's very, very hard to really have a good claim there. And here they go into the evolutionary psychologist. These evolutionary psychologists are not blank staters, right? They do believe that the brain developed over time. But one thing they say is that, well, the brain basically stopped develop in the Stone Age. So modern human skulls still house Stone Age brains, tubi and cosmides. So they say, well, 150,000 years ago, our brain was fully developed, and since then it has not really changed in any way. So we traveled out of Africa, we settled down in groups, and maybe there have been a few differences, with how our skin color evolved over time or something, or maybe our height, or some of these variables. But the Stone Age brain still remains and it's still intact, and we do have instincts across all race groups. So we have the same anger instincts, we have the same jealousy instincts, love instincts, we have the same emotional balance and stuff like that. And this is what many evolutionary psychologists believe. They do believe that we are one big species, one big race. And again, with this paper claims that this is a false claim. It's not how reality works. And even if you say that we are one group and there are only small differences, these differences, as they say, can be a huge effect. So, for example, you can have two guitars, same number of strings, they look the same, they are built in similar ways, but you can still have small differences in these two guitars, and it can make a whole lot of difference in the sound and how much they cost, and how much this guitar is worth, and who will want to play this guitar. And the same with groups. Small differences can mean a huge thing for self-control, intelligence, ambitiousness, and aggressive impulses. So, and we do see that between groups too, that these small evolutionary differences that come about after we traveled out of Africa can actually mean a whole lot. And you cannot just say that human beings have a Stone Age brain. We do, but there have been other evolutionary effects since then. They go into the black and white IQ gap. With Americans, it's 50 points. So it's one standard deviation on a regular IQ test. Yeah, and this is the major problem, black and white IQ gap. That's what makes this topic controversial to study. And here they go actually into a lot of theories about how these differences can arise and how we can measure these differences. So, for example, they say that with animal breeders, what do they say? Oh, yeah, animal breeders have bred for different traits, and we also see traits differences in human beings and have looked at genes for populations, for height and stuff like that, and how it also evolved over time. So, yeah, height has for sure been influenced by genes, they say here. So cognitive ability is 70% heritable. So in a group, at least in a Western society, about 70% of intelligence differences are heritability, explained by heritability. But one cannot say that. I hope I explained it correctly, because I'm not always great at explaining stuff. And the next argument is about, well, we can say that in the Western society, we can say that, well, a typical human being, his or her intelligence is 70% heritability, right? It's caused by genes, caused by parents. How, what kind of genes they threw into you. That's an average human being. But we cannot say the same about very poor societies, right? So if you have an extremely poor society, there can actually be some other influence there. And we do know that if the society is fairly well off, then the heritability for intelligence is extremely high. So even for people in Nigeria, if you're born in Nigeria, then, well, the heritability of your intelligence is pretty much the same as in USA or Europe, right? So because Nigeria is not that poor. It's poor, but it's not extremely poor. So the environmental effect on IQ is extremely small, like in the West. But for example, if you are born in a very poor country like Uganda, then maybe this extreme environment that's it can be so extreme that it can have an effect on your intelligence long term, at least on the average human being there. So we cannot compare a person from USA to a person in Uganda and say that, well, we can compare them 1-to-1 because we know that the environmental effect is equally strong. That's not how it works. You do need to consider these extreme negative effects because they can actually have an effect on human intelligence. But after the society progresses to a state where people are not extremely poor, then the environmental effect will practically disappear in some way. It's a bit misleading to say it this way, but yeah, it's kind of how you can understand it and how people talk about it, that this environmental effect is the same for the whole group. So the environmental effect is still extremely strong, but it's the same for the whole group. It doesn't matter if you grow up in Mississippi or Ohio, the environmental effect on the IQ will be the same. But it's still there, of course. It does. I mean, the environment does shape your IQ. The X factor. We'll skip some of this. Here they talk about, well, for example, this discrimination theory of blacks being discriminated against, making their IQ lower. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't have any basis in any academic research. But also they say it cannot explain why there's a huge difference between Icelandic and Haitian intelligence of these two groups, right? There's a huge difference, but it's not because of race, or racism. How would racism create this difference? Or maybe even racial differences in multi-ethnic countries like UK, France, or Sweden. Like you can propose that there's some cultural effect on American blacks, but this effect would not make sense in UK, France, and Sweden the same way. So you kind of have genes explaining it all, but you don't have any cultural theory explaining it all. And they go into that here, that the cultural theory that actually would need to explain the black and white intelligence difference in USA would need to be extremely strong. Like, it would need to be a huge cultural effect, and on a size and scale that we have not actually seen any cultural effect. So, and we have not even found this effect or any type of effect like this. So it will be very weird if it existed and all researchers in the world have completely overlooked it because we cannot find it. So we do need an extreme social effect to create these kind of differences. 15 IQ points between these two groups, and one group will need to experience an extremely strong effect, and the other group will practically need to avoid this cultural effect. And we don't really see that, and we don't even see how it's possible that the whole group can experience this effect in the same way. We don't really have theories that support that claim. Yeah, here they say that African pygmies are shorter, and we have known that these differences between African pygmies and other African groups in size differences have been genetic, even if we didn't have research on genes. So we didn't have any type of studies that look at genes and prove that African pygmies were shorter because of genes, but we still assume that. And this assumption was very strong and a good scientific assumption for height. And we should maybe look at intelligence the same way. Yeah, I mentioned Northern Asians with a high IQ than whites, and then Ashkenazi Jews with a very high IQ, 110, 115. So that's an extremely high IQ for a whole group of people. And again, they say here that if there's some racism effect that influences IQ, it doesn't make much sense that Northern Asians and then Ashkenazi Jews will have very high IQ, because how would the racist effect influence them in this way? They also talk about sub-Saharan IQ. It's roughly 75, but I mean, somehow I would argue that 70 or 80 or 75. And what's the natural state of the IQ? For example, if we make the country very rich and make sure that everyone has the food they need and free education or whatever and clean drinking water, and the IQ will rise because they don't have this extreme negative influence on the IQ, then the whole population IQ would kind of rise a bit. But we don't know what it will rise to. We think that maybe it's 70, 75 or 80, but we don't know exactly what it will be. It will for sure never reach 100. That's impossible, right? If they do have a genetic differences between them and Europeans, then they will never reach European levels, no matter how you change the environment. That will just not happen. Even if Flynn effect occurs, and Flynn effect is when IQ raises over time because we have more stimuli and better healthcare, better food, cleaner drinking water and stuff like that. And here they also mention that there's also a difference between blacks in USA and then blacks in sub-Saharan Africa. So in sub-Saharan Africa, the IQ is very low, but blacks in USA actually have an extremely high IQ. They have some of the highest black IQ in the world, 85, right? It's only 15 points lower than the white IQ in USA, and that's actually very, very surprising because sub-Saharan Africans have an IQ of 75, right? So where does this differences come from? How did the American blacks get that smart compared to Africans? And actually, if you look at admixture studies, if you look at how much Western European DNA black Americans have, it's about 15 to 25%. And then if you consider that, then you can recalculate their IQ, because if you have a lot of admixed genes from a population that has a higher IQ, then of course the IQ of your population will also be higher, right? Because these are genes that have higher IQ or increase your IQ. So I'm not great at explaining it, but I hope you understand what I mean. That like if a professor gets a child with a nurse that has an IQ of 100, then the child will have a IQ score about in the middle of these two, right? So this clever professor would get a child with an average woman who has an IQ of 100, and the child will of course not have exactly the same IQ as the mother or father, but will likely be in between these two. And if they have a lot of children, then all the children will likely have an IQ between these two. Of course, it's going to vary a lot. So that's how we calculate this stuff. We look at that mixture. We look, okay, how much Ashkenazi DNA do you have? How much white DNA do you have? How much sub-Saharan African DNA you have? And then we could look at these group and recalculate how we could predict the IQ. Okay, we'll predict the IQ to be about 85 because they have these white genes. And this is exactly what we see in USA, that they have a very smart black population that does very well in USA. Not compared to whites in USA, but compared to Africans, for example. So that makes a lot of sense. They also look at adoption studies where, again, you have two white parents adopting, or one white and one black parents, or two black parents adopting, adopting children into middle-class white homes. So they're all going to the same house, same household, similar economic status households. You need to have some money to adopt, right? You need to have a fairly good household. And then they look at these children and calculate the IQ. Okay, what's the average IQ of if two black parents adopt a child to this family, if two white parents, or if one white and one black parent adopt a child. And they of course grow up with IQs, we can predict that two white parents will produce a child that has high IQ, and then a mixture of parents, one black, one white, will produce a child that has a middle IQ, and two black parents will produce a child on average that has a very low IQ. And this is persist through ages, so we can test them when they're 7 or when they're 10 or when they're 15, 18 or whatever, and this difference will persist. And the parents that have adopted the children will not have any great influence on the IQ. We will very much see that that the biological parents that maybe have not even seen the child for more than a day will have a huge influence on the child, like an ginormous influence on their IQ, even though they have never raised the kids. While the people that have raised the kids for 18 years before they sent them away to their own apartments, they have basically no influence on the IQ of these children, because IQ is such a heritable trait. We also looked at the adoption studies for Asian kids, also again very interesting, especially a study that looked into how for example, South Korean or like Korean kids on average were adopted into white families, and these Korean kids actually were malnourished for some years. So they were malnourished, and then they were adopted by white families. So you could expect some negative influence of that malnourishment. But that's actually not what we see, because if the malnourishment doesn't persist for many, many years, then it does not seem to have any kind of effect on IQ. And then we see that these Korean kids growing up in the West actually have much higher IQ than whites, because they just have higher IQ genes, even though they were malnourished. Because when you break this malnourishment, when you break this negative effect, it kind of disappears. They go into a lot of theories, for example, cold winter theory. A lot of this is more hypothetical, because these kind of theories about how these differences in intelligence arrived, they are similar to evolutionary psychology kind of thinking, where a lot of this stuff is not as clear as the other stuff. So this is more, we're trying to figure out how these differences arrived and what kind of experiences these different groups went through, so that the IQ would be as it is today. But it's not as clear research, and there's a lot of controversy here, because of course there are huge amount of people and researchers who want to dispel these theories. So it's a bit more controversial, because we don't have similar kind of hard data on this, but we do try to figure out how these intelligence arises. And cold winter theory about people living in cold environment and needing to gather food, and therefore high intelligence was selected for, is actually a pretty interesting theory. And as they say here, that maybe among human beings it's too controversial to study, and most people don't want to touch that theory because it's controversial. But in animals we actually do study it, and we do have findings that support this kind of hypothesis. So we do have animal species that gather food and live in colder environments or harsher environments, that gather and store food, and therefore select for higher intelligence in that subspecies. That's just something that's interesting, that we can freely study this stuff in animals. It doesn't mean that the same thing happens in humans, but it could to some smaller degree. And then when this kind of avalanche started, when these kind of changes started, then maybe something else took over. So maybe cultural influence took over. So we have small pressure on intelligence for this subgroup of people that live in the cold environment, and then later some culture developed that took over and still focused the evolution in that direction, so that higher intelligence would be selected for. So these kind of cold winter theories could be a starting shot for the whole race towards a higher intelligence. They also have life history strategies. For example, Africans have a fast life strategy, life history. Asians have a very, very slow life history, and Europeans have a middle life history. So Africans will tend to get kids younger, and they will also die younger, and they will live a more fast life. And pressures on intelligence and intelligence selection would not be as great there, right? Because you kind of just need to reproduce a lot, get a lot of kids, and make them sustain themselves shortly in the environment, and they cannot really develop a high intelligence to sustain themselves long term. That will not be a useful strategy. And that's what Rushton proposes, that there are huge genetic differences between these subgroups, and they live via different strategies. So of course the evolutionary pressure will be totally different on these groups. Again, this is not, it's not extremely clear that this is what's going on, but a lot of these theories probably had some influence on intelligence, but we don't know how much that is, and it's still a bit out there. We don't know exactly how much this influenced what. Yeah, and Jeffrey Miller also talks about how women then could take over the evolutionary pressure, so there could be some sexual selection going on where women, they selected for higher intelligence men that could survive in this harsher environment, colder environment, store food better, develop better tools, be more clever about how they store food, and then women will be more eager mentally to select for higher intelligence traits. They will have a greater need to find a higher intelligence partner. And this is again an evolutionary pressure. Yes, this is the last of this article. Very interesting article. Very fine article. And the last thing they say, that we shouldn't lie, and that this hereditarian point of view, counter to the environmental point of view, is actually much stronger. There's more evidence for it. We have more basis to say that these group differences in intelligence are heritable and not just created by some culture and environment. And we actually don't have any good theories for the environmental claims. And even if we look at the small theories here and there, all of these small theories kind of don't make much sense. They do have a big holes in them. That's that. We shouldn't lie. And James Flynn also said that, well, even though he didn't believe that the group differences in intelligence were caused by genes, he still thought that it was a good idea to study it. He didn't have any problem with other people studying it. And that's what they propose here, that this is how we should live and this is how we should study this stuff. That, of course, it does feel a bit weird, does feel a bit controversial for some people, but it's still no good reason to lie and make up stuff and lie to the public overall and tell them that we don't have data on this, even though we do have data on this. Because if you do make sense of lie, you really need a strong argument pro that lie. You cannot just lie and then argue it's a good thing. You need to be very clear about why you lie to the public, why you try to not study something, why you try to be misleading. And no matter how good your argument is, it will be very hard to convince rational people that lying is okay in this case, unless you're really trying to save, a specific life somewhere, then maybe. Yeah, that's all. This paper, Dodging Darwin, Race, Evolution, and the Hereditarian Hypothesis. That's all. Thanks.